A young girl in pigtails lies face down on the concrete, her tiny wrists bruised by handcuffs too large for her. Her only crime? Buying markers. The officer's knee grinds into her back as the crowd watches, frozen. Then, from a sleek black SUV, a man steps out, not just any man. Hollywood's golden boy, Michael B. Jordan. But what he does next shatters every illusion about celebrity, race, and justice in America. And when the cameras stop rolling, the real question emerges. How far would you go to stop what no one else dares to confront? It started like any ordinary day in Westwood Park, the kind of suburb where parents trusted their kids to walk home alone and neighbors exchanged polite nods without ever really knowing one another. On this sunlit Thursday afternoon, the birds chirped as school let out, and kids scattered across sidewalks with their backpacks bouncing and futures still intact. Ava Daniels, no older than 10, wandered toward the corner store, humming to herself and clutching her sketchpad like it was gold. She wasn't the kind of child to cause trouble. She barely spoke in class and often spent recess alone, drawing elaborate murals only she could see. She paused in front of the store's glass door, eyeing the display of new gel pens inside, unaware that fate had already begun to tangle around her like an invisible tripwire. Inside, the store clerk was arguing with a teenager trying to return an opened energy drink, when suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the back, followed by the unmistakable screech of the shop's alarm. Confusion spread like wildfire. In that single breath of chaos, a white police officer, Officer Craig Henson, stormed in from the side street, his radio crackling, his hand already resting on his holster. Henson's eyes scanned the crowd wildly, bypassing the teenage boy now fleeing out the rear exit, and instead locked onto Ava, who was still holding the unopened pack of markers she hadn't even paid for yet. "Hey! Drop it!" he yelled, sprinting toward her as if she were an adult felon. Ava froze, her lips trembling. She took a small step back, more confused than afraid. That's when Henson lunged forward, grabbing her by the arm and yanking her to the ground with a force that made an elderly man across the street gasp out loud. A sickening thud followed as her knees hit the pavement. Her sketchpad flew from her grip, pages fluttering across the sidewalk like frightened birds. Bystanders began shouting. Phones were pulled out. Some recorded, others simply watched. "She's just a kid," a woman cried. "That's excessive," a man hollered. But the officer didn't care. He shouted words like resisting and theft even as Ava cried out, "I didn't do anything." In the midst of this chaos, a sleek black SUV pulled to a stop at the corner. The driver's door swung open, and from it stepped a man whose face was instantly recognizable. Michael B. Jordan, freshly arrived for a youth charity event at the community center just a block away. He stood frozen for a second, absorbing the sight of the little girl pinned to the ground, her dreadlocks crushed against the curb. Then something inside him snapped. He strode toward the officer, his voice thunderous and deliberate. "Hey! Get off of her. She's a child." His presence caught the crowd off guard, a mix of disbelief and relief washing over them. Officer Henson looked up, surprised, then annoyed. "Back off," he barked, keeping one knee on Ava's back. "This doesn't concern you." Michael's jaw tightened, his fists clenching. "It does now." The atmosphere thickened like a thunderstorm about to break. Cars slowed. Neighbors came out onto porches. And in that charged silence, the world pivoted. Because what began as one man's abuse of power was now unfolding in front of a man who millions watched on screen. But today, Michael wasn't acting. He was stepping into the role of a lifetime, not for fame, not for cameras, but because a child needed someone. And no one else was stepping up. Ava Daniels had always been a quiet observer of the world, a child who absorbed everything but said very little. Her voice, soft and hesitant, often got lost in the din of classroom chatter, so she learned to speak through her art instead. Sketchbooks filled with rich, imaginative scenes were stacked in her bedroom, each page whispering the stories she couldn't bring herself to say aloud. She drew cityscapes with skies that shifted from blazing gold to stormy purple, families holding hands in impossible peace, and always, little girls with wings, untethered, defiant, and free. Ava lived with her mother, Yasmin, a fiercely principled civil rights attorney who carried the weight of generations on her shoulders but never let it bend her spine. Their apartment above a family-owned soul food restaurant was modest but warm, its walls lined with books on Black history, framed protest photos, and Ava's drawings, proudly pinned up like museum pieces. Yasmin had raised Ava to be strong, but also safe, to navigate a world where being young, gifted, and Black wasn't always enough to be protected. She taught her daughter how to speak up in the face of injustice but also how to survive it, drilling into her the sad yet necessary rules. Keep your hands visible, don't talk back to police, don't make sudden moves. Ava memorized these lessons like prayers, though she never truly understood why they were needed, until now. She'd heard her mother on late-night calls fighting for clients wrongfully accused, crying quietly after losing a case. But those stories had always lived in files and courtrooms, not on concrete sidewalks beneath her own body. Ava's days were filled with art classes, homework, and time at the community center, where Miss Tasha, a retired art teacher, had taken Ava under her wing. She often said Ava had an old soul in young skin, and it wasn't just praise. There was something haunted in Ava's gaze, as if she saw beyond her years. Her father had never been part of the picture, a man Yasmin rarely mentioned beyond a pained glance. But Ava didn't feel abandoned. She felt complete in her small world, until that world tilted. Just the day before, she'd been honored at school for winning a regional art competition, her drawing of justice as a little girl hanging in the front office. Her classmates clapped, her teacher beamed, and Yasmin had even taken a rare half-day off work to be there. It had felt like a turning point, the kind of moment she might someday tell her own children about. That glow hadn't faded yet when she walked to the store for those new markers. They were a reward to herself, a way to dream even bigger. Ava never imagined that within 24 hours, she would become the unwilling face of a nationwide reckoning. The pain on the sidewalk wasn't just physical, it shattered the safe narrative of her life. As she lay pinned under the weight of authority, surrounded by a crowd that seemed too afraid to help, it wasn't just fear that surged through her, it was betrayal. The rules she followed hadn't saved her. The world her mother worked so hard to make safer had failed her. Her sketchpad, flung aside during the scuffle, lay open on the pavement, the drawing on the page smeared with dirt and footprints. It showed a girl with brown skin and bright wings, rising above a city of shadows. Now that girl looked like a joke, a cruel reminder of a hope that didn't hold up in daylight. But something else stirred beneath that heartbreak, something deeper, older. It was the legacy of every story her mother had told, every case she had fought, every injustice she had warned her about. Ava had drawn her truth in silence for years. Now, the world would hear it screamed through broken innocence. She would never forget the sting of asphalt on her cheek or the cold plastic of the handcuffs. But she would also never forget the voice that cut through it all, the deep, commanding voice of a man who didn't know her, but chose to stand for her. In that moment, she wasn't just Ava Daniels. She was every child who had ever been unseen, unprotected, and unjustly punished. And the next time she picked up a pencil, she wouldn't be drawing only for herself. She'd be drawing for a country forced to look into her eyes and reckon with what it saw. The late afternoon light stretched long shadows over the sidewalk as Ava pushed open the glass door of the corner store. The bell overhead jingled a welcome as she stepped inside, its familiar chime drowned out by the loud pop music playing over cheap speakers and the quiet argument between a teenage boy and the clerk near the register. Ava paid no attention to the raised voices. Her eyes were already locked on the shelf where the new art supplies had just been stocked, rows of rainbow-colored markers, neatly arranged and glowing like treasure under the fluorescent lights. She made her way toward them with the kind of quiet reverence only children know, her fingers hovering just above the packaging, deciding between two sets. As she debated silently, the store's back door suddenly slammed open, followed by a sharp clatter, metal cans tumbling onto the floor. Then came the blaring alarm, loud and angry, shattering the calm and making everyone freeze. The teenager at the register dropped his drink and bolted, disappearing through the back before anyone could react. The clerk, red-faced and flustered, shouted for someone to call the police, already fumbling with his phone. Ava, startled, instinctively stepped back, the marker still in her hands but her face etched with confusion. She hadn't moved toward the sound, hadn't fled, hadn't even understood what was happening yet. But the gears of misunderstanding had already begun turning outside. Officer Craig Henson had been parked a block away, scrolling through his phone and sipping coffee when the call about a possible theft crackled through his radio. He responded within seconds, tires squealing as he pulled up near the store. He didn't ask questions when he arrived. He didn't wait to investigate. He exited his vehicle with his hand on his holster, his posture rigid, eyes sharp with bias forged from years of unchecked power. He saw Ava through the store window, her skin color, her hair, the markers in her hand, and to him, that was enough. She became the suspect. Not the boy who had fled. Not the clerk who had already started pointing toward the exit. But Ava. She was small, brown, and in the wrong place at the wrong time. The glass door banged open again, and Ava turned just in time to see the officer charge toward her. "Stop right there," he barked, his voice slicing through the room like a blade. Ava dropped the markers in instinctive panic and raised her hands, but Henson didn't pause to assess. He grabbed her by the wrist and spun her around, ignoring her screams and the stunned gasps of other customers. "I didn't do anything," she cried, tears streaking down her cheeks as he dragged her outside. The sun was still out, and with it, the neighborhood. People on sidewalks. A group of kids on bikes. A woman pushing a stroller. They all turned as the officer shoved a 10-year-old girl to the concrete. His voice was loud, filled with accusations. "You think you can steal and walk away?" he yelled as he pressed her to the ground. "You think this is a joke?" Ava's pleas were swallowed by the rising buzz of onlookers. Several had pulled out their phones, already recording, capturing the horror in shaky footage. Her sketchpad fell from her bag during the scuffle, pages spilling open, exposing drawings of superheroes, city skylines, and colorful murals filled with hope. A man across the street shouted, "She's just a child," but took no steps forward. A woman's voice cracked as she begged the officer to stop. But Henson wasn't listening. His knee pressed harder into Ava's back, and she screamed, pure, primal, filled with confusion and terror. Then came the sound of a car door slamming. A commanding voice sliced through the tension. "Get off her. Now." Michael B. Jordan stood on the sidewalk like a scene ripped from a movie. But there were no cameras, no stylized lighting. Just raw, unscripted reality. Henson looked up, startled. Recognition flashed across his face, but instead of retreating, he dug in further, like a man refusing to be challenged. "Step back. I'm handling a suspect," he said, trying to maintain control. "She's 10 years old." Michael snapped. "And I just saw the real thief run that way." He pointed toward the alley, but Henson didn't even glance in that direction. He was locked in now, caught in a performance of control he couldn't back out of. Michael took a slow step forward, his voice calm but firm. "You're making a mistake." Ava looked up through teary eyes, her face flushed and streaked with dirt. In the distance, more sirens approached, back up, unaware of the full story. The crowd grew, voices louder, phones recording from every angle. The scene was becoming more than a police encounter. It was becoming evidence. Henson hesitated, his weight shifting. Michael knelt beside Ava, careful not to touch her, but his presence was a shield now. "I'm here, okay?" he whispered, loud enough for her to hear, soft enough to calm her. Ava nodded slightly, her body still trembling. The situation teetered on the edge of eruption, but Michael's presence had created something rare, an intervention without violence, a disruption without escalation. Still, the damage was done. In that instant, Ava's life had changed. So had Henson's. And Michael, who had merely planned to give a speech at a community center, now found himself holding the weight of a child's trauma in his hands, and the eyes of a nation beginning to turn in his direction. The moment Michael B. Jordan stepped between Officer Henson and Ava, something shifted, not just in the crowd, but in the air itself, as if history had paused to hold its breath. Ava, still trembling and pinned beneath Henson's knee, looked up at the figure blocking the sun. She recognized him instantly, not just from movies but from the mural on her community center wall, where he was painted among civil rights icons and cultural heroes. He wasn't supposed to be here, not like this. And yet, he was. Michael's expression was no longer that of a polished celebrity. It was of a man witnessing injustice in its rawest form and refusing to blink. Officer Henson, flustered by the cameras and the growing crowd, tried to assert control. "Back away, sir. You're interfering with law enforcement." Michael didn't move. "She's a child," he said again, his voice like thunder wrapped in velvet, the kind of voice that shook you even when it was calm. "And you're hurting her." Every phone in the crowd now had its lens trained on the unfolding standoff. The videos would soon flood social media, but in real time, no one knew what would happen next. One wrong move could trigger disaster. Michael glanced at Ava, her eyes wide with terror, then back at the officer. "Let her go. You're not going to bury this with paperwork and excuses." Henson, beads of sweat forming on his forehead, finally relented. He shifted his weight off Ava and stood up, yanking her to her feet with one rough motion. Michael reached out instinctively, catching her before she fell. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Ava nodded, though her face said otherwise. She looked like a child whose entire world had cracked open beneath her. The officer began to bark orders into his radio, calling for backup and claiming he had a situation escalating due to outside interference. But the outside interference was now the story, and it had a name, a face, and a voice that millions would recognize. The crowd, emboldened by Michael's defiance, began to speak louder. "She didn't do anything," one woman shouted. "You tackled a little girl," a man yelled, his voice breaking with outrage. "We got it all on camera," someone else added. And still, Henson clung to his badge like a shield, insisting he was following procedure. But his authority had begun to unravel. Not just because of the cameras, but because of the moral chasm widening beneath him. Michael, still cradling Ava gently, turned toward the crowd. "Someone get her mother," he said. "Call the community center. Get Tasha or anyone who knows this girl. We're not letting this disappear." Ava clung to him, not because she recognized his fame, but because he was the first adult who had made her feel safe since the moment it began. When 2 more patrol cars arrived, sirens blaring, the tension doubled. Officers stepped out, hands near their belts, ready for escalation. Henson approached them first, speaking low and fast, spinning the story into something cleaner, easier to justify. But Michael wasn't backing down. "Don't let him spin this," he told the officers loudly, for everyone to hear. "He assaulted a child. There's video. Witnesses. And I'll testify if I have to." The second officer, clearly recognizing Michael, hesitated, looking toward the growing crowd of neighbors and the dozens of phones aimed like weapons. "We'll take statements," he said finally. "Let's all calm down." But there was no calming down, not for Ava, not for the crowd, and not for Michael, whose blood was still pounding from the adrenaline of it all. He helped Ava sit down on the curb and knelt beside her, offering her a bottle of water someone in the crowd handed over. "You didn't do anything wrong," he whispered to her. "I saw the whole thing." Tears ran silently down her face, but she nodded, her fingers gripping the bottle so tightly the plastic crinkled in her hands. Yasmin arrived minutes later, frantic and out of breath, having heard the incident through a neighbor's phone call. Her eyes scanned the scene, the cop cars, the crowd, her daughter's dirt-streaked face, and her fury erupted. "Who did this to my child?" she screamed, pushing past bystanders. Michael rose and gently stepped between her and the officers. "It was him," he said, pointing directly at Henson. "And we're going to make sure he doesn't get away with it." The crowd murmured. Something had shifted irreversibly. It was no longer just about Ava. It was about every child like her. Every parent like Yasmin. Every man like Michael, watching, acting, refusing to let another moment slide into obscurity. A journalist from the local news station arrived, tipped off by the live streams. Microphones and cameras now joined the phones. Henson tried to explain himself again, but it sounded hollow in the face of the truth unfolding around him. Michael spoke to the reporters, not as a celebrity, but as a witness. "I'm not here to make a statement for the cameras," he said. "I'm here because a little girl was hurt. And we all saw it." Behind them, Ava sat silently beside her mother, the bruises forming on her wrists a dark echo of a country's deeper scars. The storm that followed wasn't just digital, it was seismic. Within hours, Ava's story was everywhere. Hashtags trended, news stations scrambled to cover the footage, and Michael B. Jordan's name surged not for a new film, but for standing between a child and a corrupt badge. The initial videos from Bystanders painted a brutal portrait, enough to stir the conscience of anyone watching. But amidst the deluge of online outrage, Yasmin, with her legal mind sharpened by a decade of civil rights work, knew something was missing, something that could take this beyond outrage and into consequence. So, she began digging. With the help of a local activist group, she obtained security footage from a deli across the street, an angle no one had reviewed yet, one that revealed a truth too damning to ignore. The grainy video didn't just show Ava's arrest. It showed Officer Henson moments before he approached her, looking around nervously, and then, after shoving her to the ground, reaching into his pocket and dropping something beside her sketchpad. A small, plastic-wrapped item that looked suspiciously like a stolen USB drive. The implications were immediate and chilling. He wasn't just using force, he was fabricating a crime. Yasmin stared at the footage in silence, her mouth tightening into a line that spoke of years spent in courtrooms where stories like this were disbelieved. But this time, there was proof. She sent the clip to multiple outlets anonymously and then scheduled a press conference with Michael and Ava by her side. When the news broke, the reaction was swift and ferocious. People who had once tried to rationalize Henson's actions now fell silent or flipped their stance entirely. The footage aired on national television. Legal experts weighed in, stating clearly that the officer had committed evidence tampering and possibly child endangerment. It wasn't just misconduct. It was a crime. The department released a statement saying the incident was under internal investigation, but that only fanned the flames. Protesters flooded the streets in peaceful marches, their signs bearing Ava's name alongside those of other children victimized by systemic abuse. Ava herself remained largely silent through the whirlwind. She didn't speak at the press conference. She didn't cry on camera. She simply held her mother's hand, and when asked if she wanted to say anything, she quietly shook her head and looked down at her sketchpad. Michael stood beside her like a wall, shielding her from the worst of it, but never speaking over her pain. He gave interviews, yes, but always redirected the attention. "This isn't about me," he said in one now viral clip. "It's about Ava. And the fact that if I hadn't been there, who knows what would have happened to her." That question became a drumbeat, echoing through social media, courtrooms, and city council meetings. The security footage ignited more than rage, it opened a window into a deeper pattern. Soon, more voices came forward. Parents who had stayed silent about similar encounters. Kids who had been accused without cause. Officers who had been pressured to look the other way. The department scrambled to contain the fallout. Henson was placed on administrative leave, but the public wanted more than suspension. They wanted justice. And for once, the scales seemed to be tipping. A local judge ordered an emergency hearing. Ava, shielded from the courtroom by protective measures, submitted a written statement with the help of her mother and Michael. In it, she described the confusion, the pain, and the humiliation of that afternoon. She ended it with a line that left the room in silence. "I didn't steal anything. But he tried to steal who I was." The courtroom, packed with activists, journalists, and legal observers, sat still as that line echoed. Michael, watching from the gallery, clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to leap from his seat. The judge, an older black woman known for her impartiality, requested to review the surveillance footage personally before issuing any preliminary ruling. When she returned, her face carried the weight of what she'd seen. "This court is deeply disturbed," she said. "Not only by the actions of a sworn officer, but by the silence that often follows them. Let the record show, silence will not be tolerated here." That moment cracked something open in the city. It was no longer just about Ava or Henson or even Michael. It was about a system forced to reckon with a child's trauma caught on camera from two angles, the truth and the lie. The security footage changed the narrative, but it also changed lives. Michael, though celebrated, became a target for certain media outlets trying to paint him as an agitator. He received threats. His team advised him to step back. But he refused. "If a child can stand through what she did," he told a journalist, "then the least I can do is not run." Ava, meanwhile, began to draw again. Not for the cameras. Not for the case. just for herself. But this time, her drawings had changed. They were sharper, bolder. And in one of them, she painted a little girl standing in the middle of a storm, her sketchpad glowing like a lantern, while behind her stood a man, tall, protective, unflinching. She didn't need to label it. Everyone knew who it was. The courtroom may have echoed with the words of justice, but the true reckoning unfolded in the quiet spaces beyond it. In the schools where children whispered Ava's name like she was both legend and warning, in the newsrooms where editors fought over headlines that finally acknowledged a system cracking under scrutiny, and in the living rooms of millions who watched and re-watched the footage, unable to unsee what had been captured. Officer Henson was eventually charged with falsifying evidence, excessive force, and child endangerment, his smugness at the time of arrest replaced with silence. He showed up to his arraignment with a shaved head and a public defender, no longer the towering figure of authority but a man cornered by his own lies. The trial that followed was fast, thanks to the undeniable footage, the testimony of bystanders, and Michael's presence as a high-profile witness. The defense tried to pivot, painting the officer as overwhelmed and acting in the moment, but the jury didn't buy it. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Henson's badge, once a symbol of power, now lay shattered beneath the gavel of accountability. But the moment that etched itself deepest into public memory wasn't the verdict. It was what happened the day after, when Ava's school held an assembly, and without warning, she was called to the stage. The principal, trembling with emotion, handed her a certificate declaring her a symbol of courage and truth, and the auditorium erupted in applause. But Ava didn't smile. She stood still, holding the paper like it was made of glass, and quietly walked to the microphone. "I didn't want to be a symbol," she said, her voice steady. "I just wanted to buy markers." The room fell silent. No one clapped after that. They didn't know whether to cheer or cry. And Ava, recognizing that silence for what it was, stepped away without another word. Her mother met her at the bottom of the steps and pulled her into a long, fierce hug. That image, of a girl in a plain dress held tightly by her mother, became the photo newspapers ran across the country. Michael B. Jordan, meanwhile, continued to support from the sidelines, refusing interviews in the weeks after the trial. When asked if he'd consider making a film about the incident, he said simply, "Some stories aren't meant to be retold by Hollywood. They're meant to be remembered." He quietly funded an art scholarship in Ava's name, endowing it for decades to come. The community center unveiled a new mural weeks later, painted by local artists and children under the guidance of Miss Tasha. In it, Ava was depicted not as a victim, but as a phoenix, rising above a city skyline, her sketchpad glowing like a beacon. Behind her stood dozens of silhouettes, teachers, artists, parents, and one unmistakable man in a hoodie, hand extended, not leading, but standing beside her. Tourists came to see the mural. School groups took photos in front of it. But Ava rarely visited. She had begun attending therapy, drawing only for herself again, and speaking only when she wanted to. The pain hadn't disappeared, but neither had her fire. And in time, her voice, once timid and quiet, found clarity, not through microphones or interviews, but in the way she looked people in the eye, unflinching. Yasmin went on to launch a non-profit dedicated to legal aid for children in wrongful arrests, calling it the Ava Project. The first case they took on involved a 12-year-old in a different city, but the echoes of Ava's story followed them into every courtroom. What was left unsaid in all the coverage, in all the tweets and articles and think pieces, was the quiet truth that healing is rarely linear. Ava still had nightmares. Michael still thought about that moment every time he passed a police cruiser. Yasmin still hesitated before letting her daughter walk alone. But somewhere in that space between trauma and resilience, a seed had taken root. It wasn't justice, not entirely, but it was a beginning. The neighborhood that once turned its head now turned its heart. Teachers trained differently. Police underwent new bias protocols. Laws were debated. Some passed. Others didn't. But a conversation had been forced into motion, and for once, it wasn't fleeting. Years later, when Ava was asked what she remembered most from that day, she didn't mention the handcuffs or the concrete or even Michael. She said, "I remember the moment someone believed me out loud. That's when I stopped feeling invisible." And that, in the end, was the story's legacy. Not just the downfall of one officer, or the rise of one girl, but the ripple of one act of courage that dared a broken world to look, to listen, and to change.